May 8, 1945, Bad Aibling, Upper Bavaria. The young woman stood at the entrance to the shower stall clutching a bar of olive green soap stamped with the letters U.S. Army, her hands trembling not from cold but from terror. Behind her, 24 other German women waited in a line that moved forward with the slow inevitability of fate itself. They had been told, warned, threatened that capture by the Americans would mean humiliation, starvation, perhaps death. Now, ordered to strip and enter what looked like communal showers, many believed their final moment had arrived. The steam rising from inside the stalls could have been anything. Gas, they whispered. It has to be gas. Then the valve turned, and hot water sprayed down in steady, scalding streams. Before we dive deeper into this moment that shattered everything these women believed, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe if you're a history lover like us. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Whether it's Berlin, Boston, or Buenos Aires, we love hearing from you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because what happened next in that shower stall would forever change how these prisoners saw the war, their enemies, and themselves. The water was real. Not poison, not gas, just water hot, cleansing, almost unbearably warm against skin that hadn't felt such comfort in weeks. The women stood frozen for several seconds, disbelief paralyzing them even as the spray soaked their hair and ran down their backs. Then, slowly, they began to move. Soap lathered between trembling fingers. Grime dissolved into gray streaks that pooled at their feet. Around them, the sounds of war had been replaced by something far more disorienting, the ordinary domestic hiss of running water. One woman wept silently, her tears mixing with the spray. Another leaned against the wooden slat wall, eyes closed, mouth open in a silent gasp of relief so profound it felt like pain. They had expected cruelty. They had braced for the worst. Instead, they received something far more unsettling, basic human decency. And in that moment, standing naked and vulnerable under American showers, they realized that everything, every speech, every warning, every promise their leaders had made had been a lie. To understand the weight of that realization, we must step back to the final days of the Reich itself, when the world these women had known was collapsing in real time. By early May 1945, Germany was no longer a nation, it was a graveyard. The Wehrmacht, once a juggernaut that had rolled across Europe with terrifying speed, now staggered south in ragged columns, its soldiers hollow-eyed and starving. Cities lay in ruins. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. And in the chaos of retreat, thousands of young women who had served as telephone operators, clerks, and auxiliary personnel for the German military found themselves caught in the flood of refugees, wounded soldiers, and desperate civilians all trying to escape the advancing armies. These women had not carried rifles or commanded troops, but they had worn the uniform. They had served the regime. And now, as the Allies closed in from all sides, they understood with cold clarity that their service made them targets. The propaganda had been relentless. For years, loudspeakers in town squares, radio broadcasts, and whispered warnings from officers had painted a picture of the enemy that was designed to terrify. The Americans, they were told, were savages, monsters. They would torture captured women, parade them naked through the streets, starve them, or worse. The Soviets, advancing from the east, where even more terrifying stories of mass atrocities had spread like wildfire, each more horrific than the last. For the young women trudging south through Bavaria in those final days, surrender felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. They carried their fear like a second skin, and it shaped every decision they made. Some debated throwing away their uniforms and blending in with civilians, but the risk of being caught in a lie seemed even more dangerous. Others whispered about suicide pacts, swearing they would never let the enemy take them alive. The terror was so thick you could taste it in the air, sharp and metallic like blood. Then came the encounter. It happened on a narrow dirt road outside a village whose name most of them wouldn't remember years later. A patrol of American soldiers appeared around a bend, young men in helmets, rifles slung across their chests, their faces smudged with dust and exhaustion. The German women froze. Hands went up instinctively, not in defiance but in surrender so total it bordered on collapse. They waited for the shouts, the blows, the rifles raised in anger. Instead, one of the soldiers stepped forward and spoke in broken German, his accent thick but his tone flat, almost bored. "Line up, names, unit, medical inspection." The words were so mundane, so procedural, that they landed like a punch. This wasn't rage, it wasn't cruelty, it was paperwork. The Americans processed them like inventory names recorded, belongings cataloged, each woman reduced to a line on a form. The indifference was somehow more unnerving than hatred would have been. They had expected monsters and found bureaucrats. The camp at Bad Aibling was a sprawl of tents and barbed wire, organized with the kind of efficiency that only an army of unimaginable resources could manage. Inside, the prisoners were divided into groups, assigned numbers, and herded toward rows of wooden tables where American medics waited with clipboards and thermometers. The inspection was clinical. Eyes checked for disease, arms examined for lice bites, hair combed through with metal tools that pulled and scratched. Then came the delousing powder of fine white dust that settled into their hair, their clothes, their lungs. The women coughed and gagged, convinced they were being poisoned. "For lice," a nurse explained in halting German, her voice clipped and professional. "Not poison. Lice." But the humiliation of being dusted like cattle, of standing in line half-dressed while strangers poked and prodded, cut deeper than any physical discomfort. They were nothing now. Less than nothing. Just bodies to be sorted, cleaned, and stored. Then came the order that stopped their hearts. "Showers, everyone." The word rippled down the line like an electric shock. Showers. The women exchanged glances, eyes wide with a fear so visceral it made their legs weak. They had all heard the stories' whispered accounts from the Eastern Front, tales of camps where showers meant something far more sinister. One woman, Erica, clutched the arm of the girl beside her and whispered hoarsely, "Do you think it's real?" The other woman, Marta, didn't answer. She couldn't. The terror had locked her throat shut. Guards handed out bars of soap, coarse, greenish blocks stamped with U.S. Army markings. The smell was sharp, almost chemical, but it was undeniably soap. Erica held hers like a foreign object, turning it over in her hands, searching for some hidden truth in its weight and texture. Around her, other women did the same, their faces pale, their breathing shallow. The line moved forward. Steam drifted from the stalls ahead, curling up into the cold Bavarian air. They could hear the sound of water, steady, rhythmic, ordinary, but ordinary meant nothing anymore. In a world where entire cities had been reduced to ash, where millions had vanished into camps, where trust had been weaponized and then shattered, the sound of running water could mean anything. At the entrance to the stalls, several women stopped, refusing to move until guards gestured them forward with calm, almost bored insistence. Inside, the wooden slats were damp, the air thick with humidity. The women undressed slowly, their movements stiff and reluctant, each piece of clothing removed feeling like another layer of protection stripped away. Naked and exposed, they stood in rows, clutching their soap, waiting for the worst. A soldier turned the valve. Water hissed from the pipes, spraying down in hot, forceful streams. For a moment, no one moved. The shock was too great. Then, slowly, understanding began to dawn. It was water. Just water. Hot, scalding, cleansing water that stung their skin and soaked their hair and washed away weeks of dirt, lice, and fear. Erica gasped, her mouth opening in a soundless cry. Marta pressed her hands to her face, soap slipping through her fingers. Around them, other women began to sob quietly at first, then with the kind of raw, uncontrollable emotion that comes when terror finally breaks. The soap foamed easily, its sharp scent filling the air. They scrubbed their arms, their legs, their faces, watching as the grime of retreat dissolved into gray rivulets that swirled down the drains. For some, the relief was so overwhelming it felt like pain. For others, the tears came not from joy but from shame. Shame at their own suspicions. Shame at how deeply they had been deceived. Shame at the realization that the enemy had just given them something their own leaders never had. Basic human dignity. One woman, Anna, leaned against the wall, her shoulders shaking. "I thought this was the end," she whispered to no one in particular. "I thought they were going to kill us." No one answered, but several heads bowed in silent agreement. The fear had been real sharp and suffocating and all-consuming. And yet here they were, washing with American soap under American showers, alive and clean and utterly bewildered by the gap between expectation and reality. The process was quick 10 minutes, maybe less before they were handed thin towels and sent back to the enclosure. But the impact of those 10 minutes would last a lifetime. As they dressed in their damp uniforms and sat together on straw mats, the whispers began. "They gave us soap. The water was hot. They didn't hurt us." Each statement was met with nods, with murmured agreement, with a dawning sense of cognitive dissonance so profound it felt like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. For years, they had been told that surrender meant destruction, that the Americans were brutal, merciless, inhuman. But the evidence before them, the soap in their hands, the clean smell of their own skin, the memory of hot water contradicted everything. Erica, still clutching her bar of soap hours later, finally spoke the thought that had been circling in all their minds. "If they lied about this," she said quietly, "what else did they lie about?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable, but it marked a turning point. The showers had not erased their captivity, had not made them free, had not absolved the war's sins. But they had done something perhaps more powerful. They had cracked the wall of propaganda that had shaped these women's entire understanding of the world. Every meal that followed tin bowls of watery stew, slices of coarse bread became another piece of evidence. Every medical inspection, every blanket distributed, every routine head count reinforced the same uncomfortable truth. The Americans were following rules. Not out of kindness necessarily, but out of a commitment to order, to procedure, to the Geneva Convention's dry, bureaucratic language about the treatment of prisoners. It wasn't mercy, it was regulation. But to women who had been raised on lies and fear, it felt revolutionary. In the days that followed, life in the camp settled into a rhythm. Wake at dawn to the sound of whistles. Line up for roll call. Receive rations predictable, bland, but sufficient. Undergo inspections. Repeat. The monotony was its own kind of torment, but it was a torment laced with safety. No bombs fell here. No artillery shook the ground. No orders sent them marching into chaos. They were prisoners, yes, but they were alive. And slowly, reluctantly, they began to accept that survival under American guard might actually mean survival not as a temporary reprieve before some darker fate, but as a genuine, ongoing reality. The contrast with the final days of the Reich was inescapable. Outside these fences, Germany was starving. Refugees wandered the roads, hollow-eyed and desperate. Cities lay in rubble. Yet here, inside a prisoner enclosure, they received regular meals and medical care. The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. The guards rotated in shifts, their faces changing but their demeanor remaining consistent, professional, distant, occasionally awkward but never cruel. Some tried to communicate in broken German, stumbling over words like Essen and Decke. Their attempts met with nervous laughter or cautious gratitude. One young soldier from Iowa handed out bread with a butchered "Bitte schön," and several women smiled despite themselves. It was the first time since surrender that anything resembling normalcy had crept back into their lives. The nurses, too, became a fixture. They checked for fevers, distributed ointments, treated infections with a brisk efficiency that somehow managed to feel almost kind. When one prisoner developed pneumonia, she was moved to a tent with a cot and given medicine that actually worked. She survived. That survival, more than any words, spoke volumes about the gap between propaganda and reality. At night, lying on their straw mats under the watchful eyes of guards, the women whispered their doubts and revelations into the darkness. Why would they treat us this way if they wanted us dead? Maybe it's a trick. Maybe it changes tomorrow. Or maybe we were wrong about everything. The conversations went in circles, but the circles grew smaller each day, tightening around a central, inescapable conclusion. They had been lied to, by their leaders, by their government, by the very system they had served. The Americans weren't saviors, no one was claiming that. But they weren't monsters either. They were just soldiers, young and tired and following orders, trying to process thousands of prisoners in the chaos of a continent torn apart by war. And that ordinariness, that bureaucratic indifference, was somehow more damning to the Nazi propaganda machine than any cruelty could have been, because it proved that the enemy was human. And if the enemy was human, then the war's justifications crumbled into dust. The soap, that simple bar of greenish-brown utility, became a symbol. Some women kept theirs long after it had worn down to a sliver, carrying it like a talisman. Others shared pieces with tent mates, rationing it carefully. It was more than hygiene. It was proof tangible, olfactory, undeniable that survival could come from unexpected places, that decency could exist even in defeat, that the world was more complicated than the black and white narratives they had been fed since childhood. Marta later said she thought about that soap every day for years afterward. Not because it represented kindness, she wasn't naive enough to call it that, but because it represented a choice. The Americans could have left them filthy, lice-ridden, sick. They didn't. Not out of love, but out of rules. And rules, she realized, mattered more than she'd ever understood. Weeks turned into months. The camp at Bad Aibling eventually emptied as prisoners were transferred to larger facilities or, in some cases, released. The war in Europe was over. The trials were beginning. The reckoning had started. And these women, who had once worn the Wehrmacht's uniform and believed its lies, carried with them a story that didn't fit neatly into the narratives of victory or defeat. They had expected brutality and received procedure. They had feared death and found hot water. It wasn't redemption, they weren't looking for that. It wasn't absolution, they knew better. It was simply a glimpse of a different kind of world, one where even enemies could be bound by rules, where survival didn't require cruelty, where a bar of soap could be the most revolutionary thing you'd ever held. In the decades that followed, many of these women rarely spoke of their captivity. The shame of having served the Reich, even in auxiliary roles, was too heavy. The relief of having survived too complicated. But when they did talk quietly, to daughters or granddaughters, in hushed conversations over kitchen tables, they always mentioned the showers. "I thought it was the end," they would say. "But it was just water, just soap, and that changed everything." Because in that moment, standing naked and terrified under American pipes, they had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Humanity doesn't always look the way you expect. Sometimes it comes in the form of a stranger following regulations. Sometimes it comes in a bar of soap stamped with the enemy's name. And sometimes the greatest act of resistance against propaganda is simply surviving, long enough to see the truth with your own eyes. The lesson these women learned in that steam-filled stall in Bavaria wasn't about heroes or villains. It was about the danger of lies, the way fear can be weaponized, how easily we accept narratives that dehumanize others, and how shattering it is when they collapse. They'd been told the enemy would strip them of dignity, but it was their own leaders who had, by lying, manipulating, and sacrificing truth for ideology. The Americans didn't restore their dignity. They simply treated them like human beings. and in a world where those rules had been shattered, even that felt like a revelation. May 1945. Upper Bavaria. 24 terrified women clutching bars of soap. More than a historical footnote, it is a reminder that small acts of decency carry enormous weight, that truth outlasts propaganda, and that even amid ruin, humanity persists. These showers didn't end the war or erase the Reich's crimes, but they revealed that survival is possible, that dignity can endure, and that simple gestures, cold, procedural, yet humane, can mark the first step toward reckoning. In the aftermath of inhumanity, these women showed that even the smallest acts of care can affirm what it means to be human.